and they were successful. They were successful in that effort until this strike broke the back of the Citizens Alliance. And so how does this impact Jews? Well, it did, because some of the trucking companies were owned by Jews, and some of the strikers were Jews, and Jews were associated with labor activism and communism. And the truckers' strike was actually led by a group of people who were allied with the Trotskyist wing of the socialist movement. All right, so we'll hear more about that strike in a second. Next slide, please. Next. Okay, here again, a little overview of population. So we're looking at 16,260 Jews in Minneapolis, which is 3.5%. And you see the population figures, and then you can see what the overall Minnesota Jewish population is. Again, I just wanted to emphasize what a small number of people we are talking about in some ways. Next, please. Housing discrimination was a major problem. In 1919, the state legislature passed a bill banning restrictive housing covenants that was drafted by well-known Jewish attorney Emanuel Cohn of Minneapolis. Housing discrimination against Jews in Minnesota, particularly rental housing, however, continued well into the 1950s. And so what you see on the left, I'm sorry, it's kind of small, but it's apartment ads from the 1940s where it says Gentiles preferred. And this is for apartments in the area in South Minneapolis and Uptown. And on the right is a pamphlet for a housing development in Minnetonka from the 1940s that also was restricted to Caucasians. And of course, the housing covenant issue has received a lot of attention recently with the Mapping Prejudice project. But the point here is that Jews actually were more able to buy houses than African Americans were, but rental housing was actually still a big concern. Next, please. Earning a living. So as I alluded to earlier, most of the Jews in this small community of Minneapolis had to earn a living. They started businesses. Some of them became doctors and lawyers. They started as peddlers. They moved up into some of the small businesses. And what you see here is actually 6th Avenue North, which is now known as Olson Highway. And so this was at one time the center of the Jewish community until it started to move a little north and west to Plymouth Avenue. But here's an example of a few small businesses. Next, please. Thank you. So there was a lot of need for help in getting employment. And so this example of the Jewish Free Employment Bureau was an organization that started to help Eastern European immigrants get work, but it ramped up in 1930 with the aim not just to help the hundreds of Jewish job seekers looking for work, and many of them would take anything part-time or temporary. These are people who wanted jobs in factories, in offices, in the trades. But they also found that they needed to educate employers. I mean, everybody was looking for work during the Depression, but there was surveys taken, and it was discovered that anti-Semitism was also a part of that kind of discrimination. Gentiles preferred was also used frequently in help wanted ads, not just rental housing ads. And even some Jewish employers were found to discriminate against their fellow Jews. So what Belle Rausch here, who was the director, she and her colleagues interviewed hundreds of employers to try and educate them, to try and persuade them, to try and alleviate their fears of hiring Jewish workers. There were a lot of things that were said like, well, Jews all stick together, they talk too much, they aren't friendly to the customers. Those kind of things were actually recorded in some surveys that were taken at the time. So the Employment Bureau worked with hundreds of employers and employees, potential employees. And this is the thing I focused on in my master's thesis, Gentiles Preferred. So there's a lot more information if you're ever curious about that. Okay, thank you. Pamphlets like these were distributed in various places around the Twin Cities. Another example of anti-Semitism beyond the kind of overt, housing and employment. So at the Fridley Waterworks in 1941, there was a pamphlet headed "Gentiles, do you want to be ruled forever by?" And then there were names of the Roosevelt cabinet, most of whom were not Jewish. And then it would give their real name and then their name and then their real Jewish name. For instance, Francis Perkins, who was not Jewish, was said to be named Francis Wutzke. Roosevelt himself was suspected of being a Jew named Rosenfeld. These are just a few of the examples of these kind of pamphlets that are found at the archives at the Minnesota Historical Society and at the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives at the University of Minnesota. Next, please. This is Rabbi Albert I. Gordon. He had, as you can see, a number of roles besides being the rabbi at a Dot Jeshurun congregation. He was a labor mediator, a radio show host, and an author. And he became a sought-after labor mediator after he worked with helping moderate, or I should say mediate, the 1934 Teamsters strike, as we discussed. And as a result of his efforts in that strike and a laundry workers dispute, he was eventually asked by 23 industries to be an impartial mediator. But not all appreciated Rabbi Gordon's efforts. An anonymous note in the files of the Central Labor Union at the Historical Society from about 1938 was entitled, "Why?" Among the questions it asked was, why, Rabbi Gordon, do you use the truckers union and out-of-town thugs to do your dirty work? Order them to use violence as you have done in the past year. Why, Rabbi Gordon, when you advocate violence, do you ask for tolerance? Well, obviously that was a lot of BS, but they also mentioned the Trotskyists, which again, another association with Judaism because Leon Trotsky's birth name was David Bronstein. He was born a Jew. Next, please. So I talked about the rise of fascism in Europe and the United States, and that meant that there were a number of pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi groups that also arose here in the United States. And one of them was the Silver Shirts. And they made a splash in Minneapolis in the mid to late 1930s. They were by no means the only group that historian Bradley Hart calls Hitler's American friends, but because they play a role here in Minneapolis, I focus on them. So here's William Dudley Pelly, a very dashing fellow. He had been a screenwriter in Hollywood. He had actually a fairly successful career as a writer, but then he evidently saw a vision and he saw Hitler's rise as fulfillment of a prophecy, wherein Pelly would create a Christian militia to save the US from upcoming political and spiritual chaos. So here, that is a real wanted poster for Pelly. He was wanted for fraudulent financial activity in 1934. He wriggled out of that, but eventually was convicted of sedition and sentenced to prison in 1942. And after he got out, after 8 years, he continued his whacked out publishing activities. And one of them, next slide, please, was a publication called Liberation. Oh, go back to there, the one before this there. So here's portrayed on a front cover of Liberation is Roy Zachary. So he was a national Silver Shirts recruiter who came here to Minneapolis twice in the summer of 1938. And the Silver Shirts also held a series of meetings in Minneapolis in 1936. And a series of newspaper articles by Arnold Eric Severide in the Minneapolis Journal exposed their motives and activities. And some of I think the older listeners might remember, yes, it's that Eric Severide from CBS television, and he was a native of North Dakota who went to the University of Minnesota. Next, please. This gentleman is George K. Belden, and he sort of figures in two ways now, because he was the, as you can see his title, the Associated Industries of Minneapolis that he was the head of actually was the new name for the Citizens Alliance. So after the Teamsters strike was successful, the Citizens Alliance, which was all the major employers in Minneapolis, they rebranded themselves as Associated Industries. So George Belden was found to have attended some of these Silver Shirts meetings. And then Rabbi Gordon, who you were introduced to earlier, wrote a letter to the directors of Associated Industries, and he asked for an explanation of why Belden was at the Silver Shirts meeting. And you can imagine what Belden said. Oh, I was just there as an individual. I was disgusted. Some of my best friends are Jews. These are all things he said. And then Rabbi Gordon sent copies of his letter and the response he got to the 3 daily Minneapolis newspapers, where the letter and replies from the Associated Industries were front page news. And many letters to the editor were printed after that in the dailies, the labor press, and in the local Jewish press. Next, please. So another manifestation of anti-Semitism during this era was Evangelical Christianity. The Reverend William B. Riley of the First Baptist Church in Minneapolis. This is not First Baptist Church, but it's still there. It's off of Hennepin near 10th. He defended Belden's right to attend any meeting that he wished. And this was not the first public stand of certain fundamentalists against the city's Jewish population. I should note too that Riley was known to preach anti-Semitic sermons from the pulpit, as was George Mecklenburg, who was a Methodist pastor who had a radio show on WTCN, and he was banned from the airwaves after giving an anti-Semitic radio lecture titled "Who Runs Minneapolis?" And so the building you see here is the River Lake Gospel Temple that was located until probably the 80s or 70s, the building on the corner of East Lake Street and River Road. And this is where many of us enjoy meals at the Longfellow Grill. This is where the River Lake Tabernacle was located. And so Luke Rader, the minister there, you can see his name on a sign, and you can see WDGY. He also broadcast anti-Semitic stereotypes on the radio and ran for mayor in 1939. And, you know, at the same time in the United States, there was the Catholic father, Charles Coughlin, who broadcast this kind of same message from the Church of the Little Flower in Michigan. And so again, this is another phenomena that happens here, that happens nationally. Next, please. And then the 1938 Minnesota governor's race, also seen as an important milestone, a negative milestone in this era. So this cartoon is called The 3 Jehu Drivers. And so supporters of Republican candidate Harold Stassen used anti-Semitic tactics to discredit the Farmer Labor Party and its incumbent governor, Elmer Benson, in the 1938 governor's race. So Benson and his predecessor, Floyd B. Olson, both had Jewish staff members, which was a first. And that's who you see riding on the back of this donkey horse that's labeled Governor Benson. So you had, I forgot his first name, Rutchick and Art Jacobs and Abe Harris. You can see that yourself. So Stassen supporters charged that the Farmer Labor Party was quote unquote run by Jews. And this cartoon was displayed on posters and billboards throughout the state. And whether or not that was the sole reason that excuse me, Elmer Benson was defeated, but he was defeated, and Harold Stassen, yes, that Harold Stassen became governor. Next, please. So the governor's race of 1938, like it was seen that something really needed to be done by the Jewish community. So after this governor's race, a lot of groups from around the state that were informal groups that were trying to combat anti-Semitism joined together to create the Anti-Defamation Council. I'm using the word that the name that it's known by now and for a long time, the Jewish Community Relations Council. And so here is Samuel Shiner, who was the longtime director, and he was charged with reviewing reports of anti-Semitic incidents and running outstate offices. And so this Minnesota Jewish Council was the first independent statewide Jewish community relations agency in the United States. And so the kind of things that Shiner did was that he protested anti-Jewish remarks, hate-filled leaflets, and swastika graffiti. He exposed attempts by real estate agents, resorts, and employers to subvert anti-discrimination laws, whether by using code words such as selected clientele or our favorite Gentiles preferred. And so he did a lot of letter writing, threatened boycotts, and wrote letters to the editor. So next slide, please. We get to World War II, and conditions for, we're fighting Hitler, and things got sort of better, but not really. There was still a lot of anti-Semitic activity, such that in 1946, Carrie McWilliams, who was a nationally known journalist, wrote an article that made a lot of splash. We can talk about this in the questions too. Minneapolis, the Curious Twin, where he described Minneapolis as perhaps the anti-Semitic capital of the United States. So one of the articles I've written for one of those publications actually looks at this publication and kind of looks a little more deeply into whether that claim was really valid. But be that as it may, it stuck as a term, and it is still how Minneapolis is seen. And this term, this also upset Hubert H. Humphrey, who in 1945 was elected mayor on a reform ticket. So these studies that you see, he appointed these studies, the Mayor's Council on Human Relations and the Mayor's Self-Study, which focused on conditions in the city for Jews, Blacks, and Japanese Americans in employment, housing, and social life. And the results were not pretty. But these studies led to various communal groups working for local and statewide anti-discrimination legislation. So here's Humphrey in 1948 with two rabbis from the Bethel congregation, Rabbi Abelson on the left and Rabbi Aronson on the right. Next slide and last slide. So even Jewish doctors were not immune to discrimination. So here is a really old and cool looking, I must say, image of Mount Sinai Hospital that was built, that opened in 1951. And so during World War II, there was a shortage of hospital beds in the area, as well as the fact that Jewish doctors were finding that they were not admitted or given admitting privileges to the private hospitals in this region. So Mount Sinai opened as a Jewish-sponsored, non-sectarian hospital founded as a direct result of the Jewish doctors' exclusion from these staffs. And so this Mount Sinai was located near Franklin and Chicago, and it closed in the early 1990s when this kind of situation was, the Jewish doctors were no longer being discriminated against. So just to conclude this little part, ordinances, laws, the next slide, please. Ordinances and laws, educational efforts, and Jewish community vigilance led to a decline in overt acts of public anti-Semitism by the 1950s. But covert attitudes continued for decades, and obviously never completely go away. So Minneapolis, as I said at the beginning, the situation here was egregious. However, this was common in other parts of the country as well. And this kind of experience stayed with people in the community for decades. And so, in fact, I remember hearing about it from my parents and from other elders, which led me to pursue all this research. So for now, I will turn it over to Brandon to discuss how things are now.
Great, thank you so much. Let me get this up into the thing. Okay, that is the correct window. Great. All right. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
All right, perfect, great. So hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Schorsch. My pronouns are he, him. I work at Jewish Community Action. We are a local Minnesota nonprofit that has been around since the mid-1990s. Most of our work revolves around bringing members of the Jewish community into solidarity work with many other people. So our work is typically focused around things like housing accessibility and other types of policy, like progressive policy fights that happen. I am the, very recently though, JCA launched Combating Anti-Semitism and White Nationalism program. I am that person. So hello, everyone. This is a truncated version of a 101 presentation that I give through Jewish Community Action. And I do want to stress that when I'm talking about anti-Semitism today, you will be kind of surprised, because here's some things to expect. This presentation isn't going to be a whole list of hate symbols, tropes, and slurs. I'm not going to be going through a list of here are all of the current today's worst anti-Semites, things like that. That's not what this presentation is. The goal of this part of the presentation is to get you thinking about that covert aspect of anti-Semitism that Laura was just mentioning at the end of the presentation. The overt stuff, that stuff that we see every day, it's a little easier to recognize. But understanding how that becomes something that is acceptable or something that is common, we have to understand how that covert, how that under the radar aspect works. I will also be providing this slideshow to the hosts to provide later. I have a habit of doing big walls of text for my slides. So if you're hurrying, trying to write down a lot of stuff, don't worry. You'll get the information afterwards. I will ensure it. And why do I use this approach? Why does JCA use this? Our social and material conditions, so the conditions that exist for us culturally living, and also the actual things affecting us today, are impacted by the events and the conditions of the past. If we're unaware of how and why these things were happening, it makes it harder for us to organize ourselves, our communities, and our movements. So we don't know that something bad was happening. That actually kind of makes it easier to repeat the bad thing, right? It's that old adage of those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But the trick is that history isn't just names and dates like we often learn in school. It's learning entire ways of being. So first, I want to just show a quick case study. I said I don't have that many images, but I like to start this one off for any time I'm talking about contemporary anti-Semitism, because this is a really good example of what you'd see out and about. This was actually in a widely televised political advertisement in 2018. And here we can actually see quite a few different calling cards, dog whistles, if you will. Of course, we have George Soros in the middle. He's a very, very wealthy person. He happens to be Jewish. He here is pictured with his hands like this, which I'll come back to later. But that's an older cartoon trope from the Nazi era that I'll show later. And then piles of money. I don't think I have to explain that one as much. These ideas of connoisseur of chaos, funder of the left. This is this ascription of Jews being in power, Jews controlling the levers of society. A lot of that type of stuff that we're seeing in those farmer labor, the anti-farmer labor ads that Laura showed. And then since this is 2018, it needs to have a little bit of what are some hot button things to go and get people scared. We've got Colin Kaepernick in the background taking a knee with this idea of funding of the left, and then this scary group of people wearing masks around a burning trash can. I'm guessing they're supposed to be Antifa. However, I can tell you, knowing many anarchists myself, you will never see that many anarchists be able to coordinate their outfits like that. So just think about that. So this is quite a few different images all in one. And all of them we'll get back to and unpack why these are all together and why we see them so often. Another example, I spotted this one day. This was just, it was a Slate article. I saw it pop up on my phone. I saw this bit, and I saw a couple of things that felt icky to me. As a Jew who studies anti-Semitism, I was like, there's a couple things in here. So first off, back to the hands, which I'll show in a second. But we're also seeing some charged language, foil and plan, a lot of things like this. It's this implication of like a little bit of sinister power. And we've got this whole hands thing. And I was like, where have I seen this before? I know where I've seen it before. I've seen it in The Happy Merchant. The Happy Merchant is an extraordinarily common meme again. It is based very heavily off of Nazi propaganda cartoons from the 1930s and 40s. And it became extraordinarily popular again, starting roughly in about like 2014, all throughout today, among many parts of the internet. Now it's mainly relegated to your very overtly Nazi parts of the internet, but it did become very, very popular for quite some time. And it's really important for understanding how do these things spread today. Yes, you still have people dropping flyers. Yes, you still have people going and citing things over radio and television. But a huge aspect of what's changed between then and now is this aspect of the internet. And I'll get back to that at the very end of this, because first I want us to be thinking about how does anti-Semitism as a form of oppression and marginalization work? What's the logic of it? Because even when things seem illogical, there is an internal logic to them. There is something within a system that at least tries to describe itself to itself. So why is it important for us to talk about anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is fundamental to white nationalism and the conspiracy theories that are driving dangerous rhetoric across the country and the world right now, and for quite some time. And Jews have been physically attacked, and our pain and fears often used as a political football or a wedge between us and likely allies. One thing that many, many, many Jews across the United States and many Muslims across the United States were very panicked about all day on Saturday during the hostage crisis was that this was going to be used as an excuse to go and ramp up more Islamophobic rhetoric, to go and blame Muslims for the actions of one person. This is an example of Jews now having to go and worry in our own moment of oppression about another community. And it's not that we don't care about another community, it's because we care about another community. When communities are working together, we can see how these moments can be used as wedges between each other. And that's one thing I've seen over the last 48 hours. It's been very beautiful. This absolute rejection of this wedge rhetoric that we had seen quite often over the past 20 years, especially since 9/11. And for non-Jews, it's important that the Jewish community has allies who understand what's going on and how to respond. Many allies just haven't been able to recognize anti-Semitism or don't have an analysis, but have been eager to learn. So if these things are new to you, or if you run into somebody who thinks they know a lot about these topics, and then they're repeating these things, that's okay. It happens, right? Like there are many things that we repeat in our world that we don't realize are bad until we're told otherwise. So just keep that in mind. So what is anti-Semitism? It's anti-Jewish oppression. It's a system of ideas. It's a whole family of ideas based off of white supremacy and European Christian hegemony. I'm using a lot of words, and don't worry, I'll break them down. Passed through a society's institutions that enables the scapegoating of Jews and the ideological or targeting of Jews that results from that. So that's a whole lot. We've got some jargon in here, so let's unwrap it. First off, what the heck is a Christian hegemony? Christian hegemony is a really important concept to to be aware of, especially when you're trying to understand what's going on for Jews or for other religious minorities. Because Christian hegemony is something that we often take for granted. Living in the United States, we are a predominantly culturally Christian country. Even if people aren't all practicing, enough people have familiarity with general concepts of Christianity, the general culture of it, that it kind of rubs off in a lot of spaces. So this is a predominance of Christian values or belief systems in a society, including education, political, social, economic, and legal systems. You can see that in lots of places, and it doesn't necessarily have to be mean or ill-intentioned and nefarious on purpose, right? It can be Christian holidays being prioritized in a public school calendar because the administrators are just thinking, well, I'm going to be off that day anyways. They're not thinking about Jews, but they're also not purposely wishing harm upon Jews. That would be an example of just something that happens under Christian hegemony. But that still is really marginalizing. For people who are Jewish, for people who are Muslim, for people who are in minority faith groups, Christian hegemony is a really big thing. It's something that weighs down on us as we have to go and try explaining our belief systems, what they are not. And it makes things difficult to navigate from time to time. Christian supremacy, though, is a little different. It's a parasitic relationship that's formed when Christianity serves power and domination. So like think divine right of kings, Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale. Those are good examples of when Christianity is used for supremacist ideals. That's very different than Christian hegemony, which is just describing that, yeah, there's a lot of people who are Christians, so a lot of Christian things kind of just getting out there in the ether, but can still marginalize people. Christian supremacy is a very intentional marginalization of people. So, all right, you explained what this hegemony business is, but what the heck's a Semitism? Why am I saying Semitism to begin with? It's because of a guy from 1870s Germany named Wilhelm Marr. He was a German nationalist. That often doesn't end up well. He wanted to go and rebrand the concept Judenhass, or Jew hate, and give it a little bit more credibility. And think about what this time period was, 1870s, 1880s. It's this industrial revolution that's happening that has now hit this point where now you're seeing electrification of cities. You're seeing trains connecting places more than ever before. The world has shrunk, right? People can get across the world, get messages across the world so much faster. It's an age of science, supposedly an age of reason. And things like this became very popular. A lot of pseudosciences became treated as the real thing. Things like phrenology, the measuring of skulls, a lot of aspects of race science. This was just another one of those fads, trying to go and make a outwardly political idea into something that was scientific. He took the word Semitism from the world of linguistics. Semitic describes a specific language family that does include like Aramaic and Hebrew, but has nothing to do with what we're talking about with anti-Semitism. He just borrowed that word. And within this worldview that he prescribes, he uses aspects of Darwinism, aspects of social Darwinism specifically, the idea that human beings and specifically races are competing with each other, just like animals would be within a very, very, very simplified version of Darwin's Origin of the Species. And with that, he proposes a world where the Jewish race, as he calls them, is inherently inclined within themselves to undo European Christian society. And his response was, this was a logical thing to be identifying, and it would be the right thing to be against this concept of Semitism. But what he was describing wasn't new. It didn't come out of any, he didn't come up with this whole concept of anti-Semitism one day. He just went and threw a name onto it and tried to go and give it a little bit of a scientific shine, because anti-Jewish oppression is ancient and extremely modern. And I know I said I'd be talking about today, but understanding today, we need to understand then, and not just what was happening in our neck of the woods, but what was happening globally. So Jews have been in this buffer scapegoat role physically and rhetorically for a long time. Jews have been blamed for a lot of things in a lot of places over a long period of time. So there are some aspects, though, to today's anti-Semitism, to contemporary anti-Semitism, that make it a little bit different than what the surface level would make you think. The initial surface level is, Jews are being treated different because of their religion. Jews are being treated different because of their ethnicity. Well, both of those are true, but there's an extra aspect to how anti-Semitism describes the world today, how it describes Jews, that is very unique to our time period. And that is the ascribing of power, economic domination and control. These older periods had a lot more of this religiously inclined marginalization. But in the late Middle Ages, we're moving out of this period of Jews being oppressed and marginalized based off of largely a Christian notion of Jews are different. They did not convert. Jews killed Jesus, things like this. And now we're moving into the late Middle Ages as the world is starting to change. There's some big things starting to change, and this anti-Jewish oppression is still happening, but Jews are starting to have more opportunities for jobs because the world's getting more complex. And they need people to be doing some of these new jobs. And some of them, as we see in late Middle Ages Europe, early modern Europe, is the role of tax collectors. We see this a lot in Eastern Europe. Nobles are pushing peasants off of their lands. They're taking their lands away from them and having them work in harder and harder feudal contracts that they have to pay up taxes. Now, the thing is that the nobles don't want to ride around and collect taxes themselves. So they begin hiring Jews from some of the local shtetls to go and pick up the taxes. So if you're a peasant in Eastern Europe and your only interaction with a Jew is somebody coming to your door, taking your money every month, and you're told all of these things about them being strange, different, killing Jesus, it's going to go and add a lot to these concepts that you have around a whole group of people. And that story about somebody coming to your door taking money is going to go and build up over the centuries. That is going to go and turn into things like Jews are actually controlling the prince. Jews are actually behind this. And at the same time in Venice, at that same time period, we see the production of what is kind of like early banking, what today's banking is like. And contrary or parallel to the story that many people believe that Jews are associated with banking because Jews were the only people who were allowed to give out loans during this period of high Christianity. Now, part of that is true. Part of that is, but the big thing is where the power in that relationship is, because Jews during this period in Venice said we wanted Jews to go. Venice opened up a specific island within the city, tried to go and bring in a Jewish community, mainly because they were looking for people who were literate. Many people in medieval Europe were not literate. Jews, many more were literate because of the various aspects of I'm trying to find a way to describe it without just being like bar and bat mitzvahs. Anyways, we read the Torah. We have a lot of aspects of literacy within our community that were not existent in many of these same places in Middle Age Europe. And because of that, Jews began to be hired to work in banks. However, they're only the people who are doing the contracts. Many of these Venetian princes who are Catholic still own the banks themselves, because that idea of excommunication, it only applies if you're actually doing that part yourself. So these things are still being constructed. Jews are part of the story. Jews are here. Many Jews do become individuals who get assimilated into society. But society is changing. It's becoming more complex. And the story around who Jews are is changing as well. And it gets more and more and more complex over these centuries of colonialism and imperialism, as Europe goes and moves from this period of late feudalism into this period of colonialism and starts going and forcibly colonizing the rest of the world. We start to see the story of Jews still go and grow in this way. By the time we hit the Protocols of the Eldars of Zion, which came out in 1903 and was penned by the Tsar's secret police, we see a fully formed version of what is most familiar to us with today's anti-Semitism. This idea of a secret cabal of Jews controlling the world, talking about how they're going to go and do their next political machinations. That's what the protocols are supposed to be, a secret set of meeting minutes from a shadowy meeting of rabbis. Shoot, I'm looking at the time. And because I want time for Q&A. So we can jump again, and now we can look at a US context of what anti-Semitism looks like with that buffer role applied to Jews. When we go to the civil rights movement in the United States, there is quite a bit of solidarity between Jewish communities and African American communities across the country, in the fight for voting rights, the fight for civil rights. And as segregationists and as people like those silver shirts mentioned earlier in the presentation are realizing that they have lost various aspects of this battle against the growing cause of civil rights, a lot of the blame that that some of these groups start ascribing is towards Jews. That Black Americans could have never organized on their own. It was the meddling Jews. It was Jewish lawyers who did this to us. It was X, Y, and Z. It again comes to this idea of Jewish control over these other peoples. Now, lastly, there are many stereotypes and common tropes that come along with these aspects of Jews being involved in finance or being in jobs that have aspects of social respect that we kind of put on a pedestal in the United States. Things like lawyers, doctors, things like that do end up getting a lot of respect in this country. And there are many stereotypes and common tropes that often can feel like they are positive, that they aren't meant to be harmful, but still are that. So saying to a Jewish person, oh my gosh, you're Jewish? I wish I was good with money. Like, you might be like, oh no, I'm making fun of myself. I'm not good with money. That still is anti-Semitic. Even if you meant it in a good way, it still is. The idea that, I wish my community was more focused on successful jobs. That also is this idea of a model minority. The idea that one group has special powers that make them a little different than others. And it's something that we see applied to Asian American communities quite frequently when it comes to things like education. The model minority trope is applied to many different groups. Jews are not unique in that. But that is one aspect of anti-Semitism that has a lot of similarities to other forms of oppression that you may be familiar with. So anti-Semitism is like the synthesis of historical and structural scapegoating. I'm going through I almost swore, my bad there. Going through a lot of history here, fast forwarding through many, many centuries. Normally I'm doing this presentation with 90 minutes, so my deepest apologies. But the biggest thing I want people to take away is that anti-Semitism, it's more than just individual acts of hatred. It's more than just, it's more than just slurs. It's more than just hate symbols. It's more than just attacks on synagogues. It's a set of lies that largely white supremacy tells us, and it's for a reason. And it is because as it has changed from its origins in Christian persecution, anti-Semitism has had a very, very different nature around it because our world's become more interconnected and the power of these anti-Semitic narratives have grown. They've gone from just being something that was, we're going to go and attack a community that's nearby that is strange and different, to now it is viewing a very small community as being in charge of the entire world. How did we get to that point? We got to that point because capitalism, and I'm talking about this larger social phenomenon. I'm not talking about any political parties or manifestos or anything like that. This larger economic system that has been built up over the last 5 centuries needed racism in order to dehumanize Black and brown people to exploit for free and cheap labor. And at that same time that all of this wealth was being extracted from around the world, anti-Semitism as a story grew and grew and helped go and create a scapegoat story that helps obscure capitalism from itself. Think about how many anti-Semitic tropes that you hear today involve things like Jews control the banks, Jews control XYZ industry. A lot of these aspects are almost shortcuts where people are identifying some weird things that are happening around them. Like, our systems sometimes don't work very well and they hurt people. And people feel that, but because anti-Semitism portrays this easy shortcut narrative, it is often something that is found to be the most attractive and easiest route that people end up taking. It's because the story has become bigger and bigger. So how does anti-Semitism function systemically, especially since in the United States and in most of the Western world right now, Jews aren't directly oppressed via the law. Like governments aren't writing Jews can't do this into their laws anymore. So how does it work systemically? Well, first off, Jews are often isolated, especially from other exploited groups. This can be rhetorically. It doesn't have to be just physically into a place like a shtetl. We're isolated. We're viewed as different. We're viewed as unique. And our oppressions are viewed as somehow different than other people's oppressions. And other oppressed groups often get manipulated out of identifying and fighting the immediate sources of their exploitation, and instead are encouraged to identify as Jews as the source of their suffering and channel their anger at Jews. Good examples would be Jewish. There have been many times where the myth of Jews as landlords, that all Jews are landlords, or my Jew landlord, things like that, end up being used to go and stoke communities who are renters who may have really bad landlords, to go and specifically start targeting Jewish community members instead of actually going and being able to deal with their landlord, doing things like rent strikes. There are ways in which one can properly go through methods of change, and then there are improper ways where we isolate and attack groups. So Jews then end up being targeted for violence or other danger. That's not a great feeling. It's horrible. It's the worst. And in the hopes of gaining safety, Jews were pressured to cooperate with the ruling elite. So a really good example of everything that happened this past weekend is there's a really quick knee-jerk reaction in the post 9/11 world of, wow, somebody who is Muslim came into a synagogue, did all this stuff. Well, Jews, you can't trust Muslims anymore. And in exchange, we need to give you even more police officers to keep you safe. But who kept everybody safe there? The rabbi did. The rabbi went and did all of that negotiating that really, really kept people safe in that room, in that moment, throughout that day. And that's something that we should really be thinking about, especially as these conversations keep going, because synagogue attacks are scary. They're really scary. But there's a lot of aspects where, just like when we're having to deal with school shootings, we have to go and look at what has a larger police presence in schools done. Has it prevented school shootings? No. What can we do to go and get to that root of the problem rather than the place where the problem happens? So in the hopes of gaining safety, we end up often finding ourselves in positions where we are further marginalized, or we curl up. We stay with ourselves. It's easier to be with other people who understand what you're going through. And eventually the cycle kind of starts again. So what's the point? Why am I talking about all this? So anti-Semitism today ends up keeping the wheels of economic oppression turning. And it obscures class, caste, and racial oppression. It makes it harder for us to identify all these interconnected aspects of our modern society, because it creates a shortcut where now it's, the bad things are the Jews. So anti-Semitism gives us this idea that Jews are the man behind the curtain, controlling the levers of power in a very Wizard of Ozian way. But in reality, anti-Semitism functions as the curtain. The myths that anti-Semitism tells us, the larger stories, end up functioning as that curtain, getting us away from those larger conversations. So what does anti-Semitism today look like? It functions differently than other types of oppression, making it harder to recognize, because in a lot of cases, it appears to be punching up. It describes this scenario of pushing back against people in power. It describes this scenario of, this is the bad guy. He's got all this power. It's all right. We're going up. A lot of other forms of oppression are much easier to identify because they're so much clearer to be bullying. When it's very clear that a community does not have access to the same types of resources, when it's very clear that a community is deprived of a lot of opportunities and resources, it's really easy to go and identify attacks, verbal or otherwise, as bullying, as punching down, as attacking people who have less. However, the story of anti-Semitism is Jews are very powerful. one of the main pillars of anti-Semitism is keeping this Jewish face on the front of power, because Jews then become the target of people's rage. Because there's a lot of things happening in the world, and there's a lot of power, and power is more, diffuse than it was in previous time periods. Previous time periods, you have kings. You don't have very, very large amounts of moving parts going around at the speed of light, because that's how quick the internet moves. Anti-Semitism is a nice shortcut. It moves it to, this is it. This is who did it. So like a turning gear, anti-Semitism, it's cyclical. It's generally strongest when Jews are otherwise assimilated and doing well. So when Jews are facing fewer of those moments of everyday heckling and have more opportunities to be in places like those nice jobs, being assimilated into the world, that is often when we see the biggest booms of anti-Semitism really start to happen, at least within the very modern context, like within kind of the West. And that's a feature, not a bug, because with this tale that anti-Semitism tells, this contemporary anti-Semitism, is that Jews have to have some sort of power and influence to make the stories seem true. So some anti-Semitic tropes do seem like compliments, like I mentioned earlier, but they're still lies that white supremacy tells us, and they should be interrogated. So why is it hard to identify? We often hear about it from people we don't trust. When I say that, I'm saying it as Americans. We live in a hyper-polarized world where we often only view things through one side or the other. We often view things as, we have two parties, Democrats or Republicans. We often view a lot of problems as one thing or the other. Because of that, it's very easy to get confused around topics like anti-Semitism, because if it's being used as a political wedge issue, we're going to hear it really loudly from people who were like, why are they talking about that? And that makes it really confusing. It also looks different than other types of oppression. Like I mentioned earlier, it makes this appearance of punching up. We're also taught about anti-Semitism in a very specific way. In the United States, most of our familiarity, if you are not Jewish and if you don't go out of your way to go and study these things, our coursework in schools often just covers anti-Semitism at its most violent and at its absolute peaks. So most of our familiarity with anti-Semitism is the Holocaust. And it's not the lead up to the Holocaust. It's not the decades and decades and decades of how these things happened, how these cultural things arose. It's just, it happened. Or this guy got elected, then a few years later it happened. Same with pogroms. Sometimes those are covered, and it's just, in Russia, the peasants hated the Jews, and that's what happened. We don't hear much else. We hear only about anti-Semitism in these very, very violent ways, and then it makes it really hard for us to not recognize moments of anti-Semitism unless they are very violent, unless it's another horrific event at a synagogue. A lot of times we don't hear about it as a moment of anti-Semitism. Another reason it's hard to identify is because divisions between Jews and our likeliest allies have been encouraged, pushing us out of relationship, so we don't know each other as much. Makes it very difficult. So a good example I used earlier was post 9/11, and really starting the decade or so before that in the United States, we really saw this wedge placed rhetorically in like television and places, telling us this idea that Jews and Muslims don't get along, like cats and dogs. Stories like that, they build up, and people, if you don't know a Jewish person and you believe that, it's really easy to believe that because there's nobody to go and tell you that's not actually true. So these stories are powerful, and they make it harder for communities to organize together, because if we have these assumptions about each other, we're never going to be able to sit down and be able to work together. So, all right, wait, what time is it? Perfect. This will be my last slide. I had extras, not knowing how long I would take. So why do we need to understand this now? Anti-Semitism works in relationship with xenophobia and racism, diverting people away from the systems that are oppressing them. It makes it harder for us to identify a lot of these larger issues if we focus on distractions. It makes it harder to see how these things are linked together. We can't change these systems if we buy into these diversions. And our movements need to learn about and be able to identify these underlying power structures to be able to dismantle these aspects of racialized capitalism and massive power inequality. And it's not believing it's the Jews. There's a lot of work that goes into changing a lot of these systems that for centuries were built up on a lot of not good things. Not one law is going to go and just be the magic edit undo button. It's a long-term project that all of us have to be thinking about. And lastly, this political moment, it's loaded with conspiracy theories, and a lot of them have super direct roots in anti-Semitism. So it's really important to unpack and undermine them when we see and hear them. So with that, I'm going to close out my presentation so we have time for questions. And I will send out my larger presentation out with the materials afterwards, if that's all right, Diane.
Okay, so I can now hear everybody. Very good. Or see everybody. I guess I can't hear everybody since I have you all muted. It's now time for questions, and we still have quite a bit of time. So if there are questions, please type them in the chat. And then what I'm going to do is kind of direct them to Laura or Brandon or maybe Robin, depending on what the question is. So I'm going to, and hopefully I get to all of them. So let's see. Question for the panel. A few years ago in a public presentation at Temple Israel in Minneapolis, a representative of the Anti-Defamation League named opposition to Zionism as an indicator of anti-Semitism. Do you agree? So I'm not sure who wants to take that, but I will, since it's somewhat recent, Brandon, maybe we'll start with you, and if I'm wrong with who should, and then someone explained, okay, answer that question first. I'm sorry.
I am happy to first explain Zionism and then this question.
Okay.
So firstly, for those who don't know, Zionism is a political philosophy. It's the idea of a specifically Jewish nation state. Nation states are things like France. France is a nation state where pretty much everyone there for a very long time was French or French speakers, or was forced to become French speakers. Not every place is a nation state. The United States is not a nation state. We're a whole bunch of little tiny states in a nation made up of lots of people from a lot of backgrounds. Most places actually are. Zionism was a political project. It still is a political project, and it's a political philosophy. With that explanation, next I need to go and state Jewish community action. We don't do anything involving Israel, Palestine, or anything involving explicitly Zionism. For those who are not Jewish, who are not as familiar with these conversations, these are controversial conversations even within the Jewish community. These are things that we talk about and disagree with each other all the time about. I would say it is a big mistake to go and view all Jews as inherently Zionists. That would be anti-Semitism. To go and view all Jews as inherently viewing the same thing at the same time. That actually is an example of anti-Semitism. But opposition to Zionism inherently is not anti-Semitism. Do people who mistake Jews for being Zionists at all times, are they being anti-Semitic? Yes. But it becomes very difficult for us to answer this question if you're unaware that anti-Zionist Jews exist. There are many, many, many anti-Zionist Jews, and they're not anti-Semitic. And that is where this conversation becomes very difficult for people who are not Jewish, just immediately jumping into it, which it can be overwhelming. And thank you for asking these questions. It's good to ask these questions.
So Laura, do you have any additional comments to make about that?
When it comes to my topic, which is the period up until the 50s, I don't. There were a lot of Zionist organizations in Minnesota in that era, and they were seen as important, ways to combat anti-Semitism in terms of having a homeland. And again, not all Jews were Zionists. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
Okay. The next question, can you address how Jews were not considered white, and when did that change?
I can start by
go ahead.
talking about how it was, in the 19th century and early 20th century, Jews are explicitly defined as not white for both religious and racial reasons. And it's a situation that evolved, I would say, as Jews became more economically secure and more assimilated into American society. And so for some of the reasons that Brandon talked about, they are no longer seen as an oppressed group. And so there's a whole amount of literature about, Jews and whiteness, excuse me, and when that happened, how that happened. Again, it's a little beyond what I am prepared to talk about tonight. I could do that another time, but not tonight because I don't have a presentation on it. I didn't do the research tonight on that.
So on that part of Jews being considered white, not white, like Laura was saying, a lot of the shift really started coming in that period around and after World War II, like where we really start seeing that happen in law, and we start seeing it happen on things like census forms, stuff like that. Aspects like that we start to see after World War II. But a good term to think about this is, I read it, I cannot remember where I read it, but it really stuck with me. Conditional whiteness. Jews have been treated as conditionally white, right? Many Jews, not all Jews, and keep in mind, 20% of all American Jews are Jews of color. They are Black, they are indigenous. There are many, many, many Jews who are not pale of skin like myself. And that's an important thing that many people do not realize about the American Jewish community. But for Jews who are conditionally white, a lot of that really comes with how assimilated are you? How Jewish do you act? Are you too Jewish? Many Jews who present themselves as more Jewish end up not getting those benefits of whiteness in everyday society the same way that someone who is Jewish but maybe does not wear a kippah would get. So those are some things to be thinking about with Jews and whiteness. Jews have some benefits of white privilege. A lot of those aspects of, not necessarily sticking out in a situation, but there are many, many other aspects where it still is conditional.
Okay, next question. What about the BDS movement? And I guess I'm going to ask that you first explain what the BDS movement is.
The BDS movement is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. It's built very similar to the movement that was built around the economic isolation of apartheid South Africa during the 70s and 80s. I would say that taking the materials that you learned from this evening and looking at these larger aspects and thinking about how not all aspects of anti-Zionism are anti-Semitic, read more into BDS and come to your own conclusions. I find a lot of people will go and just say things about it and often don't know the requisite parts. People who are anti it won't know much about it, and people who are presumably for it won't know much about it either.
Okay, so it sounds like the next question, I didn't get the question quite right last time. So Paul is asking, I believe Minneapolis anti-Semitism was more prevalent than St. Paul since industrial power, hold on, I gotta read down. It's kind of hard since industrial power was more concentrated in the hands of some specific families. Can Laura speak further about this and about then Mayor Humphrey's successful efforts to fight this? I believe he came up with a plan that shamed these families' businesses into being less anti-Semitic.
Yes, so the German Jewish families that I mentioned that settled St. Paul, there was cultural similarities with the non-Jewish early businessmen and settlers of St. Paul too, which helped create less of a them and us kind of situation. And I mentioned the capital that they brought and the successful businesses. Whereas in Minneapolis, the Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite had the capital and didn't need anybody else's, and they did establish the major industries, the milling industry, in particular. And again, these were the people who were members of the Citizens Alliance and who prevented unionism. And they weren't, what about the Scandinavians, you might ask? They were also not part of the elite in this period. And so you had kind of this, the Anglo-Saxon elite set the tone, which trickled down into the middle class, working class, Scandinavians and Irish. And so, yes, it's true that there was a different kind of social situation and economic in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And, again, it's attributed to the fact that the German Jews arrived at the same time as the other people who settled the early Minnesota territory in St. Paul. Not the case at all in Minneapolis. By the time people started arriving, the Eastern European poverty-stricken Jews and who, were fleeing pogroms and economic oppression, the elite, things were already established. So as far as Mayor Humphrey, I never heard about a specific plan to shame these people into being, but there were these kind of, I would say, happy talk kind of civic, commissions that were done after these studies, and where Humphrey and the other civic leaders were trying to get the employers of Minneapolis to agree to not discriminate in employment. And it was at this point, even by the 50s, it was like Black people. I mean, they talked about Japanese Americans, but I think it was because of what was happening during the war and the internment camps. So it was less and less about Jews and more about other minority groups. So yeah, and remember, I should have mentioned that Humphrey was ambitious, and he was elected to the Senate within, less than 4 years after he was mayor. So his concerns moved into a national level, but he was still interested in what was happening here.
Okay, so I'm going to keep this going because we have about 10 minutes left and questions are starting to pile in. Can you please highlight examples or summarize how anti-Semitism appeared or exists today in education? And I've got to go in Minnesota, especially at college university level, were Jews restricted from enrollment? I think K-12 examples include attempts to ban books or restrict teaching of history, such as about anti-Semitism. What other examples in history are now? So.
Briefly, like just from then, there were some quotas in professional schools at the University of Minnesota, and then there was a major exhibit at the university about attempts to surveil Jewish and African American students on the part of University of Minnesota administrators in the 40s and 50s. It's still online, and so the Jewish students were seen as agents of communism and radicalism, and they were also prevented from living in the dormitory sometimes. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that I am aware of from the then.
Anything you want to add, Brandon?
You know, in terms of things that are happening now, I would say it's a very testy issue right now. I I would say keep an eye out on the ways in which you see a lot of the stuff around the banning of books from libraries or banning of topics from curricula. Anti-Semitism usually doesn't end up being something that gets buried the same way that racism does. There's a lot of reasons for it. There's an entire like vein of people who are very interested in just like Jews existing in Israel to go and like fulfill end time fantasies and things like that. But because of that, there's some weird infatuation with Jews sometimes. Philo-Semitism is what it's called, where it's actually kind of this icky anti-Semitism where it's like, oh, don't worry, I don't hate Jews, I love Jews. And then once you start talking, it's like, I've never heard more anti-Semitic stuff in my life. And that's actually the type of stuff I would say that in today's day and age, to really look out for more of when things around banning books comes up. Because when people are talking about critical race theory, things like that, quite a few of the writers who were foundational to a lot of the studies and thought that's going on, a lot of them were Jewish. You have people like the entire Frankfurt School, who right now at JCA we're reading a book on anti-Semitism by those folks. And a lot of those folks were Jewish, and a lot of the language around Judeo-Bolshevism, Judeo-Marxism, cultural Marxism is the new one. A lot of that actually has its basis in exactly that fear of Jews bringing in communism that Laura was mentioning. That still actually is a very pervasive way of bringing anti-Semitism into public places today without saying Jews explicitly.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment, so.
Oh, there's one more.
Okay, one that
It's
just
more
came-
for Brandon.
Okay,
About outreach to other communities, such as between Jews, African Americans,
Okay.
Native and whites, to build stronger connections.
Absolutely. Honestly, I feel wrong creating such a short list, and I'll just go and just say a couple of things coming off the top of my head. Lots of these things are going on every single day. The really big thing is that with organizing, if you don't hear about it, sometimes you just never know about it. It's not something that really gets talked about in news as much. It just kind of happens. So Jewish Community Action, where I work, we've been doing this type of work for about 25 years. Work between Jewish communities, African American communities, Indigenous communities. I do a lot of our work around our Combating Hate Coalition that recently worked with Hennepin County to go and commit $1 million of the funds they were getting in from COVID relief to specifically identifying and combating hate crimes. That was really a lot of work from a lot of our other partner organizations, like the Coalition of Asian American Leaders. In the same week that a synagogue here in St. Louis Park was targeted and they had to shut down their services, 2 days prior, the same group that had targeted the synagogue had just trashed the Hmong Cultural Center in St. Paul. And that was a moment where our communities came together and said, no, that's not happening. And while many of our partners were working with like the state and law enforcement on that aspect, we said, all right, we're going to go and work with the county, and we're going to go and make sure that the next time something like this happens, there are actual resources for community members to contact. Because while we as Jews are very lucky to have many of these institutional organizations that cropped up over 100 years ago to address these things that happen, like the Jewish Community Relations Council, Anti-Defamation League. Many other communities don't have that, and having our state and having our counties being able to help build up these systems, it allows all of our communities to be more resilient. So that's one example. And then, you know, the other example that I would say is looking at what happened in Texas this weekend. The rabbi there, for years and years and years, had been doing work with local Muslim communities. and Christian communities. But he had been doing a lot of this, very specifically going and doing this type of coalition work, doing this type of intra-community work, or intercommunity work. I used the wrong intercommunity work. And those are the types of things that really shine through during that horrific hostage scenario. Those are the types of skills and talents and world knowledge that allowed for that situation to come to something that very thankfully only resulted in one death. And thankfully it was none of the hostages, but at the same time, out of any situation, we should hope for no deaths. And but that reduced amount of horrific pain really came from all of that beautiful work that rabbi and many members of his congregation have been doing for years and years and years prior to something horrible happening.
Well, and we have a thanks for highlighting CAAL, and thank you, Hetty, for then explaining it's the Coalition of Asian American Leaders. So I appreciate that. So with that, it's time for our program to end. We, part of what we're trying to do in community education for the Robbinsdale School District is really bring our communities together. And we feel that education is one of the first things that we can do in highlighting all of our communities and therefore helping us understand and work together. We just so I'll do a little plug for the next program. Our next program is on February 15th, and it's East African culture in Minnesota. So the same place that you went to register for this, you can find that in there. We try to do these every month during the school year. So some similar topics from year to year, but there's always new things. So I want to thank Laura and Brandon and Robin for being our panelists today. And thank you so much. It was I think I learned a lot myself. So again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and us.
Diane,
Yes.
could you please share the Jewish Historical Society information before you close?
I will try.
Thank you. And thank you all. This was wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.
I don't have it up right away. So I don't have it to be able to do as everyone's leaving. So.
Okay, so I just quickly for whoever's still here, for more information on the Jewish Historical Society, please see our website, jhsum.org. And feel free to contact us with any questions, anything we can do, and thank you.
So Robin, we're going to send out a link. I know that Brandon has a presentation. We'll send that out by email to everyone who registered, and we can certainly send out information on the Jewish, on your group at the same time.
You can share mine too if you want.
Yep.
Excellent.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.